The Battle of Agincourt was part of what was known as the 100 Years' War between Britain and France. Due to the King of England also being descended from the Duke of Normandy, the King of England was also related to the King of France, and a claim was put forward by the English King that he should by rights also be the King of France. This claim was of course rejected by the King of France, and a series of battles raged on for 116 years, with many pauses and treaties in between. That at least was the official position. It was really about money and power. This time, the King of England controlled many regions of France. In theory, most of these lands were actually owned by the French king and run on his behalf by a subordinate noble in the person of the King of England, something that didn't sit too well with the King of England. So, the King of England wanted to rule these areas as their king, not some duke who was supposed to be loyal to the King of France. The other major issue, as with many of the medieval wars, was concerned money. Now, raising an army, feeding it, equipping it cost money, and lots of it. That money was either paid by the local nobles or by the king himself. This led to a fairly common arrangement in battles, which was the ransoming of prisoners after the battle was over. This process had a major impact on how the battles were actually fought. If a noble was captured alive during a battle, he could be ransomed off, and that money be used to pay for the army that fought in the battle. Alternatively, the person who was actually captured was already out of pocket for paying for the army, could end up being bankrupt by paying the ransom on top of the other money he'd already paid out. This kind of risk-reward situation meant that many medieval battles were normally dictated by attempts to get the opposition to surrender rather than kill as many of them as possible. In theory, a common soldier who captured a noble could ransom him, elevate himself and actually become a noble, or a noble who was captured could lose all of his money and become destitute. This then tended to influence tactics on the battlefield, where nobles wanted to fight other nobles and in general avoided fighting with the common soldiers. Since wars and battles cost money, there were some serious negotiations going on between the two kings, and a settlement of the dispute was almost reached. The proposed settlement involved those lands being held by the King of England become part of the Kingdom of England rather than be part of France. And in turn, the King of England would give up any claim to the throne of France. In addition, France was to pay the outstanding balance of ransom of an earlier king, King John of France, who had been captured at the Battle of Poitiers. Most of these terms were actually agreed upon by the King of France, except for the sum of money. There was a counter-offer of a smaller sum of money. This ended up being rejected as negotiations broke down. The army then sailed from England to Normandy with the hope of capturing some more territory to add to the possessions already existing in France. In the process, strengthen the King of England's position and weaken the King of France. Now, a key English objective was the port of Harfleur in northern France. Harfleur was then besieged, eventually taken, but taking of the port had taken longer than expected and weakened the English army. This time taken meant that the French army was now on the move in an attempt to bring the English army to battle and defeat it. Having seized Harfleur, but not having a powerful enough army to guarantee victory against the French, it was decided to march the English army towards the port of Calais, which is currently in English hands. And then the troops could all sail home. The northern part of France is crossed by many major rivers, including the river Somme, and the English army needed to cross all the rivers to get to the safety of Calais. So to prevent this, the French army blocked all the river crossings. Two armies marched up and down opposing sides of the rivers. Eventually, the English army managed to cross the Somme without having to fight a major battle in the process, and now in theory could march to Calais in safety. Now, even though the French army outnumbered the English army, they were well aware of the power of the Longbow at the earlier Battle of Crécy, and knew that superior numbers weren't enough to guarantee a victory against the English army. The French army blocked the main road to Calais, while the majority of the English army were armed with longbows. It also had a smaller number of knights and men-at-arms. However, the longbow was in general a defensive weapon. Ideally, the archer stood in one location and fired arrow after arrow at the enemy. It wasn't a practical weapon to use charging towards the enemy, and the English knights were vastly outnumbered by the French. Ideally, the English army needed a way of clearing the French troops that were blocking the road, and also of stopping a mass charge of the armoured knights rolling up the entire English army. Now, part of the army that was most vulnerable to hand-to-hand combat was, of course, the lightning-protected longbowmen. Mounted knights could manage to get to grips with the longbow armed troops in a charge. The battle would be lost fairly quickly. However, horses aren't the bravest of animals on a battlefield. The blood and noise in most battles will scare the average horse. But the horses of the knights were trained for battle. Part of the huge cost of maintaining an army of knights comes to both down to paying for the handmade armour and weapons of the knight, but also in paying for the training of the war horse to overcome the natural fear of the battlefield. Some of the horses were also armoured to the front and neck, where an accidental blow from another knight might injure the horse, possibly as a result kill the rider. And in general, another knight wouldn't attack a war horse, as if you capture the rider, you can also gain the very valuable horse. Other soldiers, however, might be more concerned with their own health and welfare to mind if they hurt a horse, so might strike directly at the horse rather than the rider, giving knights another reason to avoid combat with anyone other than a knight. With the fear of mounted charge uppermost in the archer's mind, they were actually equipped with a sharp pointed stake which could be placed in the ground, creating a kind of hedgehog defence that even trained war horses would be reluctant to cross. The English army was deployed in a ploughed field between them two fairly dense wooded areas, which was thought would be impossible for mounted troops to pass through easily. So the English troops were arrayed across the gap between the woods, with large numbers of archers forming several groups across the field, with densely packed men-at-arms and dismounted knights between them, ready to fight the enemy knights. The English army marched within longbow range of the French army, and then the archers placed the stakes in the ground, prepared to fire at the French. Now at this distance, the killing power of the longbow was its weakest, with virtually no chance of penetrating the French armour. So rather than fire directly at the French knights, the archers fired their arrows high into the air, meaning as they were coming down nearly vertically when they hit the opposing troops. While these arrows did virtually no damage to the opposing soldiers, it did have an impact on the opposing horses, especially on the unarmoured back and rear of the horses. And with some of the French knights now having their valuable horses killed or wounded under them, knights, rather than get their own archers and crossbowmen to fire back at the enemy, knights were determined to move over to the attack as soon as possible. However, attack against the English line wasn't as easy as it would seem. The ploughed, muddy fields slowed the advance of the knights, and was further slowed down by occasional bolting wounded horse who had thrown its rider, wandering across the front. The English also started to send a few archers down the sides inside the woods to fire at the flanks of the advancing army when they got closer, to reduce the impact of any charge even more. Now, the first three lines of French troops slowly edged their way towards the English army, steadily taking casualties on the march. As they got closer to the English line, the archers switched from high-angle fire to one where they fired directly at the oncoming troops. Now with the shorter range, the arrows were able to punch through the steel of many of the knights, creating uncertainty in the French line. Troops, though, were eventually able to make it to the English lines, and avoiding direct combat with the archers, they made a disordered rush towards the waiting English men-at-arms. Though the French army was in total far larger than the English army, because only a fraction of the troops had so far been used in the attack, and the archery had meant that the French attack wasn't a single mass wave of troops. The French actually found themselves outnumbered in the hand-to-hand fighting. French knights had also had to lower their visors of their helmets to prevent them getting an arrow shot in the face, so only had a very narrow slit to see the battle through, a situation made worse by the sweat and steam created by the battle. As a result, French knights were soon pushed back by the English men-at-arms. With the muddy, churned-up ground of the battlefield, many knights fell over and were pounced upon by lightly armoured archers who took up axes they had been using to sharpen stakes, and now lay into the vulnerable, confused knights, resulting in many of them surrendering and being escorted behind the English lines, where they could be ransomed later. The second French line then followed the first, as the ground they marched over had been churned up even more by the first attack. Their attack fared even worse than the first, especially since most of the high-quality armoured knights had fought in the first wave. However, not was all was lost for the French. The French still had a substantial third wave yet to fight. In addition, the local knight of Agincourt, who knew the local terrain, led a group of lightly armed troops through paths in wood on an attack on the English rear and attempted to sack the valuable baggage train. English leadership, then concerned about the attack on the baggage train, combined with a huge number of prisoners milling around behind the English line, a potential attack from a third wave coming in from the front, was a risk of being caught between the French troops from front and rear. The risk was so significant that a controversial order was given to execute the French prisoners, prevent them from rejoining the battle. The attack on the baggage train, though, was soon beaten off by the Guards, but more heavily armed than the attacking French troops, and the third wave, seeing what happened to the first two waves, lost heart and faded away, meaning no final attack occurred, and French prisoners need not have actually been killed. The result of the battle left the road to the Calais open, and the English marched into Calais in victory. The result of the battle was a decisive one for the English forces, and a devastating defeat for the French. The slaughtering of the prisoners prevented the victory from being an absolute victory for the English, as they were deprived of a huge potential gain in ransom money. But the loss of so many French nobles and knights for the French set them back decades, even sending the French king over the edge into madness when he heard the result of the battle.